At 2:17 a.m., the hospital was already winding down. Lockers slammed softly. Coffee cups were tossed. One final shift ended the way it began, quietly, without ceremony. No speeches, no applause. Just a nurse removing her badge, folding her scrubs, and closing a locker she'd used for years. Then the air changed. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Not rushed, not loud, controlled, purposeful. Doctors looked up first. Security froze next. 6 men in dark uniforms stopped in front of the lockers, not the ER, not the operating rooms. One of them spoke, voice low and steady. "Ma'am, we're sorry we're late." Before anyone could ask a question, they raised their hands in unison and saluted. The nurse didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there, eyes calm, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. And in that frozen hallway, everyone realized the same thing at once. They had never known who she really was. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're drawn to powerful stories with hidden truths and unforgettable twists, make sure to subscribe. Street Alara Medical Center never truly slept. Even at 2 in the morning, the building breathed machines, humming monitors, chirping stretchers, rolling softly over polished floors. The night shift moved with a different rhythm than the day, quieter, leaner, more exposed. Fewer hands, fewer witnesses. Mistakes here didn't echo, they disappeared. Evelyn Carter stood at the medication station, finishing the last of her charting with the same steady handwriting she'd used for years. Her dark blue scrubs were faded at the seams, sleeves rolled once, always once. Hair pulled back tight. No jewelry except a simple watch on her left wrist. Its glass scratched, the numbers still clear. "Evie," someone called softly behind her. She turned to see Marianne Lopez, the charge nurse, leaning against the counter with a tired smile. Marianne had worked nights for 22 years and could read exhaustion the way others read vital signs. "You don't have to stay late," Marianne said. "Your shift's done." Officially. Evie nodded. "I know." She always said that. "I know." Calm, neutral, as if acknowledging facts was the safest way to exist. Marianne hesitated. "I'm sorry it's like this. No send-off." "No," Evie lifted a hand gently. "It's fine." It wasn't false modesty. She truly meant it. Attention made things messy. Messy led to questions. And questions were dangerous. Across the ER, Dylan Hargrove stood near the central desk, sleeves rolled too high, tie loosened just enough to look hands-on. He was technically operations director, but he liked being seen where people were busiest, like the illusion of authority earned through proximity. He glanced at Evie, then at his tablet. "Carter," he called, voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Before you disappear, I need you to cover Bay 4. Short-staffed." Marianne frowned. "Dylan, her shift. She's still on the clock," Hargrove snapped. "And we don't have the luxury of sentiment." Evie met Marianne's eyes and gave a small nod. "It's okay." Always smoothing the edges. Always absorbing the hit. Bay 4 held a middle-aged man in acute respiratory distress, oxygen saturation dipping into the low 80s. The resident assigned to him, Dr. Lucas Bennett, barely 30, brilliant on paper, was already flustered, fingers tapping too fast against the chart. "He's not responding to the nebulizer," Lucas muttered. "I'm thinking intubation." Evie stepped in beside him, voice low. "Give it another minute. Elevate the head. He's panicking, watch his breathing pattern." Lucas hesitated. "We don't have time. 30 seconds, Evie said. Not louder, just certain. Lucas watched despite himself. 30 seconds later, the man's shoulders dropped. Breathing steadied. Oxygen ticked upward. Lucas exhaled. Okay. Good call." Evie was already adjusting the IV. Lucas studied her for a moment. "You've done this a lot." Evie didn't look up. "Enough." He almost asked more, but the way she said it closed the door. From the corner of the bay, Hargrove watched with narrowed eyes. He didn't like when staff solved problems without him. Didn't like competence that didn't ask permission. "Bennett," he called. "Stick to protocol." Lucas stiffened. "Yes, sir." Evie felt the familiar pressure behind her ribs, not fear, not anger. Something colder. Memory. She finished the task, checked the monitor one last time, then stepped back. As she did, the collar of her scrub top shifted just enough for a thin chain to glint under the fluorescent lights. Lucas noticed. It wasn't flashy, just metal. Old, worn, smooth. Evie adjusted the fabric immediately. "Personal item?" Lucas asked, casual. Yes, that was all. At 2:28 a.m., a low vibration ran through the floor. Subtle, almost imperceptible. A supply cart rattled faintly against the wall. Most people ignored it. Evie didn't. She paused mid-step, head tilting just slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Marianne noticed. "You feel that?" Evie nodded once. "Probably construction," Marianne said. "Or HVAC." Evie said nothing. At the security desk near the elevators, Frank Delaney, a retired cop working nights, frowned at his monitor. One of the helipad access indicators had shifted from green to amber. That never happened without notice. He tapped the screen. "That's odd." His radio crackled. "Security clear, rooftop access in 15. Frank straightened. "Copy. Who's the requesting agency?" A pause. Then, "You don't need the name." Frank swallowed. "Understood." Hargrove, overhearing, snapped his head around. "What's going on?" "Rooftop clearance request," Frank said carefully. Hargrove scoffed. "At this hour, it's probably a drill. I'll handle it." He marched toward the elevators, already rehearsing how he'd assert control. Evie watched him go. Her jaw tightened, not in fear, but calculation. She turned back to the medication station, opened her locker for what she thought would be the last time. Inside spare scrubs, a folded photo turned face down and a sealed manila envelope taped to the back wall. No name. Just 3 words written in black ink. "If this happens." Evie's fingers hovered over it, then dropped. "Not yet." She closed the locker. Lucas approached, lowering his voice. "Hey, this might be weird, but how do you know the helipad elevator code?" Evie met his eyes. For the first time that night, something flickered there, an old weight surfacing. "Because," she said evenly, "sometimes knowing the fastest way out is how you keep people alive." Before he could respond, the building shuddered again, stronger this time. Lights flickered, conversations died. From somewhere above them, a distant, unmistakable sound rolled through the hospital. Thump, thump, thump. Rotor wash. Evie closed her eyes for half a second. "So it's now," she thought. And somewhere between the ceiling tiles and the locked doors of the helipad, the truth was already descending. The sound didn't announce itself the way sirens did. It didn't scream for attention. It pressed instead, low, rhythmic, undeniable, seeping through concrete and steel until the entire building seemed to vibrate in agreement. Thump, thump, thump. Conversations dissolved into half words. A nurse dropped a chart. Somewhere down the hall, a patient asked if it was an earthquake. Evelyn Carter stood perfectly still. Marianne looked at her. "That's a helicopter, right?" Evie nodded once. "Navy," she said quietly. Marianne blinked. "How would you rotor cadence?" Evie replied. "And the pitch?" She moved before Marianne could ask another question. The helipad elevator, normally sealed after midnight, sat at the end of a restricted corridor. Red signage warned authorized personnel only. 2 security doors stood between it and the rest of the hospital. Tonight, both lights glowed amber. Unlocked. Frank Delaney reached the first door just as Evie did. He glanced at her, surprised. "Miss Carter, this area's I know," Evie said gently. "I won't cross the line." She stopped exactly 2 feet short of the threshold. Frank hesitated. He'd worked security long enough to recognize posture. Evie wasn't sneaking. She wasn't curious. She was ready. His radio crackled again. "Security status. Rooftop clear," Frank said, swallowing. "Per request." "Good. Stand by." The elevator chimed. Across the ER, Dylan Hargrove pushed through a cluster of nurses, face flushed with irritation. "Who authorized this?" he barked. "This is a hospital, not a military base." No one answered him. The elevator doors slid open. 6 figures stepped out in dark uniforms, no visible insignia except subdued patches stitched clean and precise. They moved with an economy that drew the eye without demanding it. No weapons were raised. No voices were lifted. But every instinct in the room screamed authority. The lead man, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, scanned the corridor once, then focused on Frank. "Chief Aaron Reyes," he said. "We're looking for Evelyn Carter." Hargrove pushed forward. "I'm the operations director here." "You can't just..." Reyes didn't look at him. "I need to see Evelyn Carter," Reyes repeated. Frank glanced back at Evie. She stepped forward. "I'm here." Reyes's posture shifted not dramatically but unmistakably. He removed his cap. The others followed, caps tucked under arms in perfect unison. "Ma'am," Reyes said, voice steady. Permission to proceed. Evie closed her eyes for a brief, controlled moment. "Yes," she said. What happened next shattered the quiet in a way noise never could. The 6 men raised their hands and saluted. Every inch of the corridor froze. Marianne's breath caught. Lucas stared, mouth slightly open, his brain scrambling to reconcile the woman he'd met hours ago with the gravity now aimed squarely at her. Hargrove laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "This is a joke," he said. "You can't, she's a nurse." Evie didn't look at him. Reyes held the salute for 3 full seconds, then lowered his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "we apologize for the delay. Clearance took longer than expected." Evie studied his face. "I told you not to come here." "With respect," Reyes replied. "You also told us never to let this night pass without acknowledgement." A murmur rippled through the staff. Lucas swallowed. "Evie, what's going on?" She turned to him. Her expression was calm, but something old and heavy lived behind her eyes now, like a door cracked open after years sealed shut. "Lucas," she said, "I need you to step back." He did. Commander Olivia Grant entered the corridor, then crisp uniform immaculate despite the wind still echoing from the roof. She carried a leather folio under her arm, and a gravity that quieted even Hargrove's sputtering protests. "I'm Commander Grant," she said, projecting without raising her voice. "United States Navy. I'm here on official business." Hargrove puffed his chest. "You're disrupting hospital operations." Grant turned to him at last. Her gaze was cool, assessing. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "your name appears repeatedly in our file." His face paled. "File?" Grant stepped past him and stopped in front of Evie. "Dr. Evelyn Carter," she said. "Or, as you were known in service." Evie raised a hand. "Not here." Grant nodded. "Understood." She opened the folio just enough for Evie to see the top page, a formal commendation bearing seals Lucas had only seen in documentaries. "You chose anonymity," Grant said. "You chose silence. Tonight was the first window we had to honor that choice, and still do our duty." Reyes reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet case. He didn't open it. "I won't take it," Evie said. "We know," Reyes replied. "This isn't for display." Hargrove stepped forward again, anger replacing fear. "This is absurd. She's an employee on her final shift. If there's a problem, it goes through me." Grant turned fully now. "Mr. Hargrove, you are no longer in a position to manage this situation. I run this hospital." "You obstructed care," Grant said evenly. "You manipulated internal reviews tied to veteran treatment protocols. And you attempted to retroactively terminate an employee to block benefits guaranteed by federal statute." The corridor went silent. Marianne covered her mouth. Lucas felt the floor tilt under his feet. Evie spoke then, not loud, not harsh. "Dylan," she said. "Stop." He stared at her. This is your doing." Evie shook her head. "No, this is the consequence," Grant signaled subtly. 2 agents in plain clothes stepped forward from behind the seals. Dylan Hargrove, one said, "You're being detained pending formal charges." Hargrove laughed again, but it cracked halfway through. "You don't have proof." Grant met his eyes. "We have your emails, your signatures, and testimony." She glanced at Evie, including hers. Evie held Hargrove's gaze not with triumph, but with a tired kind of sadness. "I tried to fix it quietly," she said. "You left me no other choice." The click of handcuffs echoed louder than the helicopter ever had. As Hargrove was led away, the corridor exhaled. Evie turned back to Reyes. "You didn't have to salute," she said. Reyes smiled faintly. "We wanted to." She nodded once. "Then let's finish this." She reached into her locker and finally pulled the sealed envelope free. Outside, the helicopter idled. Inside, the hospital watched as the woman they'd underestimated stepped forward, no longer hidden, no longer silent, and prepared to close a chapter she'd carried alone for years. The corridor didn't return to normal after Dylan Hargrove was led away. Hospitals were used to chaos, blood-shouting alarms, but this was different. This was the stillness that followed revelation. People stood in clusters that didn't quite form conversations. Eyes tracked Evelyn Carter as if she might disappear if they looked away too long. Evie felt it all without absorbing it. She handed the sealed envelope to Commander Grant. "This contains the original incident report," she said, time-stamped. "Names included. I never submitted it through hospital channels." Grant accepted it carefully, like something fragile. "You did the right thing." Evie's mouth tightened. "I did the quiet thing." Grant didn't correct her. Marianne approached, voice unsteady. "Evie, I didn't know." Evie met her gaze, warmth still there. "You didn't need to." That more than anything broke Marianne. She turned away quickly, wiping at her eyes. Lucas lingered near the medication station, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked younger than he had an hour earlier. "You saved that man in Bay 4, he said. "You've saved a lot of people." And Evie shook her head gently. "Lucas, listen to me. What you saw tonight doesn't change what matters here." She tapped the counter lightly. "Patience, teams, respect." He nodded, swallowing. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled faintly. "Don't call me that." Security began to re-establish flow. The helicopter noise softened as the rotors slowed. Somewhere overhead, the city continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Commander Grant motioned Evie aside. They walked toward the helipad doors, stopping where the wind pressed against the glass. "We can do this formally," Grant said. "Ceremony, press." "Your family, no," Evie said immediately. Grant studied her. "You're sure?" Evie watched the doors fog slightly from temperature difference. "I didn't serve for recognition. I served because someone needed to stand where things were hardest." Grant nodded once. "Then let me ask for something else." Evie turned. "Let us put things right," Grant said. "The people Hargrove hurt, the nurses he pushed out, the veterans he deprioritized. We can't undo years, but we can start." Evie considered this. Finally, she said, "Reinstate benefits where they were wrongfully denied. Fund the night shift properly, and stop pretending nurses are replaceable." Grant didn't hesitate. Agreed. A subtle exhale left Evie's chest. Not relief, resolution. The SEALs waited nearby, quiet as shadows. Reyes caught Evie's eye. "Ready when you are." She nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." She returned to the locker room alone. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant and old soap. Her locker stood open, contents sparse now. Evie reached for the face-down photo and finally turned it over. A younger version of herself stood between two teammates, dust on their uniforms, grins too wide for the heat they'd endured. All three of them alive in that moment. She folded the photo and slid it into her pocket. From the corridor outside, a nurse's voice carried, "Did you see the salute?" "Yeah." I never even knew her last name. Evie closed the locker gently. Her watch read 2:49 a.m. When she stepped back into the corridor, the staff parted instinctively, not out of fear but reverence. It made her uncomfortable. "Please," she said softly, "go back to work." And they did. That was the strange thing, how quickly life reclaimed its rhythm when given permission. The SEALs escorted her to the elevator, not as guards but as companions. The ride up was silent, broken only by the soft whine of cables and the faint thud of the helicopter above. Reyes spoke as the doors opened. "You kept your promise." Evie looked at him. "Which one?" "You said you'd come back when it was safe," he said. "And you did." She nodded. "I also said I wouldn't stay." Wind hit them full force as they stepped onto the helipad. City lights stretched for miles, blinking indifferent and endless. The helicopter crouched like a patient animal, rotors slowing, heat radiating. Evie stopped short of the aircraft. "Reyes," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She corrected herself with a small breath. "Aaron, this ends here." He met her, gaze, understanding, settling in. "You won't answer the phone, not for a while." He smiled, sad but proud. "You've earned that." Commander Grant joined them, holding out the velvet case one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, "history will know." Evie closed the case without opening it. "History doesn't need my face." She handed it back. Grant accepted it, then extended her hand. "Thank you." Evie shook it firmly. "Take care of them." Grant nodded toward the SEALs. "Always." Evie took one final look at the hospital, at the place that had never known who she was and didn't need to anymore. She felt no bitterness, only completion. As she stepped toward the elevator to go back down, not to leave by helicopter but by her own quiet path, Reyes and the others straightened. No salute this time, just respect. The doors slid closed, carrying her back toward the ground floor, back toward an ending that belonged only to her. And somewhere deep in the hospital, beneath fluorescent lights and humming machines, a culture had shifted subtly, irrevocably, because one woman had refused to be loud and refused to be erased. By the time Evelyn Carter stepped out of the elevator on the ground floor, the hospital had settled into a strange, cautious calm. Not peace, awareness. Nurses spoke more softly, but not out of fear. Doctors paused before issuing orders, eyes flicking toward faces they had once overlooked. The ER hummed again, but the pitch had changed like an instrument retuned after years of being slightly off. Evie felt it immediately. She walked past the nurses' station where Marianne stood, reorganizing charts with more care than usual. When she saw Evie, she straightened. "Hey," Marianne said, tentative. You okay?" Evie nodded. "I am." Marianne hesitated, then rushed on, words tumbling out. "I keep thinking about all the nights. The times you stepped in without making a fuss. The times you covered for people, me included. I never asked why you never pushed back." Evie leaned against the counter. "Because pushing back isn't always how you move forward." Marianne swallowed. "I won't forget tonight." Evie met her gaze. "Don't remember me. Remember the lesson." Marianne nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. Down the hall, Lucas Bennett stood outside Bay 4, watching the patient breathe steadily, oxygen levels stable. He hadn't moved much since Evie left the corridor upstairs. When she approached, he turned quickly. "I reviewed the chart," he said. "You were right. Again." Evie smiled faintly. "You did the work." He shook his head. "I followed your lead." They stood in silence for a moment, the beeping monitor filling the space. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said. Evie considered him. "One question. Why stay?" he asked. "With everything you did before. Why come here, of all places?" Evie looked through the glass at the patient, then down the hall where a pair of nurses laughed quietly over a shared mistake. "Because this place mattered," she said. "And because people underestimate quiet rooms. That's where the most important decisions get made." Lucas nodded, eyes shining with something close to understanding. "I want to be better," he said. Evie turned to him fully. "Then listen more than you speak, especially to nurses." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am, sorry." "Evie." She accepted the correction with a nod and walked on. At the administrative wing, the doors to Dylan Hargrove's office stood open for the first time in years. 2 plainclothes agents moved through the space methodically, photographing documents, disconnecting hard drives, boxing files. Marissa Klein from HR stood nearby, pale and shaken. Evie stopped when she saw her. "Miss Klein," Evie said gently. Marissa jumped. "Oh, Evie. I mean Dr. Carter. I'm so sorry I stop," Evie said softly. "You did what you could." Marissa's eyes filled. "I wanted to help. But every time I tried, something disappeared. Records, emails, people got reassigned." "I know," Evie said. "That's why I kept copies." Marissa let out a shaky laugh. "Of course you did." Evie met her gaze. "You're not in trouble, and tomorrow things will change." "How can you be so sure?" Evie glanced at the agents. "Because secrecy only works when good people look away." She left Marissa standing a little straighter than before. The rest of the shift passed with an eerie smoothness. No codes, no traumas, just steady work, the kind that never made headlines but kept people alive all the same. At 3:58 a.m., Evie returned to the locker room. Her belongings fit neatly into a small canvas bag, years of routine reduced to essentials. She slung the strap over her shoulder and paused, scanning the room one last time. No ghosts lingered there, no regrets. When she stepped back into the corridor, she nearly collided with the hospital director, Dr. Howard Ellison, a man who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last hour. "Miss Carter," he said, then corrected himself. "Dr. Carter." Evie inclined her head politely. "Director." He cleared his throat. "I want to apologize. For the oversight. For the culture." Evie studied him. "Apologies don't change systems." "I know," he said quickly. "But actions might. I've already authorized an independent review of night shift staffing. And veteran care protocols. Evie nodded. Good. Ellison hesitated. Will you reconsider leaving? We could use someone like you. Evie smiled, not unkindly. You will, just not me. He watched her go, understanding, settling in too late to matter. Outside the city, air felt cooler, sharper. Dawn was still an hour away, but the horizon held a faint promise of light. Evie walked the 3 blocks to the parking structure, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the near-empty street. She reached her car, a modest sedan with over 100,000 miles on it, and set her bag in the trunk. As she closed it, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for a moment, then answered. Carter. Ma'am. Reyes's voice came through quieter now. Just wanted to confirm you made it out. I did, Evie said. A pause. They're moving forward with charges. I expected as much. Another pause. If you need anything, I won't, she said gently. But thank you. Fair winds, Reyes said. Evie smiled. And following C's, she hung up and slid into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try. As she pulled out of the structure, she glanced once in the rearview mirror at the hospital, rising behind her glass and steel, catching the first hint of dawn. She didn't salute it. She didn't wave. She simply drove away, carrying with her the quiet certainty that something essential had been set right, not because of rank or force, but because integrity, when tested, had held. And inside street, Elara Medical Center, long after the helicopter had lifted off and the night had ended, people would remember the shift when silence finally spoke and changed everything. Morning crept into street. Elara Medical Center, the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, thin bands of pale orange light slipping through the high windows and stretching across the polished floors. Day shift staff began to arrive, unaware that the hospital they were stepping into was no longer the same one they had left the night before. Whispers traveled faster than charts. By 6:12 a.m., nearly everyone knew something had happened. No one knew everything. A security guard had been taken away in handcuffs. No, an administrator. A helicopter had landed. Navy maybe. A nurse. Or a doctor. Or both. The details blurred, but the impact didn't. Marianne stood at the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee she'd forgotten to drink, answering the same question over and over. Is it true? Yes. What exactly happened? You should ask yourself why it surprises you. Lucas Bennett finished his rounds with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. Every patient interaction felt sharper, more deliberate. He found himself pausing before speaking, listening longer than usual, noticing things he might have brushed past before. At 7:04 a.m., the hospital director called an emergency staff meeting. The auditorium filled quickly, nurses in scrubs, doctors in coats, administrators clutching tablets. A low murmur rolled through the room until Dr. Ellison stepped onto the stage. He looked tired, stripped of polish. Last night he began "Our hospital failed" and corrected itself in the same breath. The room stilled. An internal investigation, now federal, has revealed serious misconduct at the administrative level. That individual is no longer affiliated with this institution. A ripple of restrained reaction passed through the crowd. Ellison continued. More importantly, we were reminded of something fundamental. Titles do not determine value. Character does. Marianne felt her throat tighten. Ellison paused, choosing his words carefully. Some of you worked alongside someone for years without knowing the full measure of who she was. That is not your fault. But it is our responsibility to ask why a system can make excellence invisible. Eyes shifted. People thought of quiet colleagues, overlooked ones. Effective immediately, Ellison said. We are reinstating benefits that were wrongfully denied. We are restructuring night shift staffing, and we are establishing an independent ethics channel outside administrative control. The room broke into scattered applause. Not thunderous, earnest. Ellison ended simply. Be better, all of us. The meeting adjourned. In the locker room, a young nurse named Alyssa Park sat on a bench, tying her shoes with shaking hands. She was new 3 months in and had spent most nights trying not to be noticed. Marianne entered and sat beside her. Hey, Marianne, said softly. You okay? Alyssa nodded, then shook her head. I keep thinking, what if I miss something important? What if I'm not strong enough? Marianne smiled gently. Strength isn't volume, it's consistency. Alyssa hesitated. Was she really? Marianne nodded. Yes. Alyssa exhaled, something loosening in her chest. Then maybe there's hope for the rest of us. Marianne squeezed her shoulder. There always was. Miles away, Evelyn Carter drove east as the sun climbed higher, the city thinning into quieter neighborhoods, then long stretches of highway. The radio stayed off. Silence felt earned. At 9:22 a.m., she pulled into a small roadside diner she'd visited once before, years ago, under a different name, passing through with no intention of staying. The bell over the door chimed softly as she entered. A waitress looked up. Coffee, yes, Evie said. Black. She took a booth near the window, setting her bag beside her. Outside, trucks rolled past. Life moved on without ceremony. The coffee arrived. Evie wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat ground her. For the first time in years, there was nothing pressing on her. No countdown, no contingency plan ticking in the back of her mind. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, the contact name read, "If it happens again." She stared at it, then let it ring out. Not today. She pulled the folded photo from her pocket and studied it again. Younger faces, dusty smiles. People who'd trusted her with their lives and whom she'd trusted in return. Evie slipped the photo back into the bag and reached for her wallet. She left a generous tip on the table, a habit she'd never broken. As she stood to leave, the waitress smiled. "You look lighter," she said, as if commenting on the weather. Evie paused. "I feel finished." The waitress nodded, accepting it without question. Back at Street Elara, Lucas found himself standing outside the locker Evie had used. It was already reassigned. Empty. He felt a brief, sharp pang of regret, not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd almost missed. He returned to the ER with renewed focus. A patient's breathing pattern caught his eye. He adjusted treatment early, preventing a spiral. Marianne watched him from across the room and smiled. Change, she realized, wasn't loud either. By noon, the story had reached places far beyond the hospital. No names were released. No photos circulated. Just murmurs of accountability and a quiet professional who'd refused to be erased. Evie merged back onto the highway, miles ticking by beneath her tires. She didn't know exactly where she was headed, only that it was forward. The phone remained silent, and for the first time in a very long while, that silence felt like freedom. By the third day, the silence around Evelyn Carter had grown louder than any headline. Street. Elara Medical Center had become careful in the way people spoke her name when they spoke it at all. Administrators avoided speculation. Staff avoided embellishment. Whatever had happened on that night shift was now wrapped in professionalism and policy language. But memory had its own way of spreading. Lucas Bennett felt it most during rounds. Nurses who once waited for his instructions now offered observations before he asked. Not challengingly, confidently. He listened. He adjusted. And outcomes followed. In Bay 6, a trauma nurse caught a subtle change in pupil response that would have been dismissed weeks earlier. Lucas trusted her instinct. They intervened early. The patient stabilized. As the gurney rolled away, the nurse exhaled. "Thank you for listening." Lucas shook his head. "Thank you for speaking." Marianne watched from the nurse's station, arms crossed, satisfaction settling deep in her bones. She'd seen reforms announced before, grand statements that faded with time. This felt different, less performative, more personal. At 10:41 a.m., an unmarked government sedan pulled into the administrative lot. Commander Olivia Grant stepped out, flanked by two individuals in civilian attire. They moved with the same contained efficiency as the SEALs had no wasted motion, no raised voices. Dr. Ellison met them at the entrance, face set with resolve. "Thank you for coming," he said. Grant nodded. "We won't take much time." They walked the halls together, stopping at offices, reviewing systems, confirming that promises made were being translated into actions taken. Staff noticed but didn't gawk. Something about Grant's presence discouraged spectacle. In a small conference room overlooking the city, Grant sat with Ellison and the interim ethics officer. "The investigation will proceed," Grant said. "But our concern isn't punishment alone, it's prevention." Ellison leaned forward. "What do you recommend?" Grant folded her hands. "Visibility. accountability, and respect that doesn't depend on hierarchy. Ellison nodded slowly. We're implementing anonymous reporting with external oversight. Good, Grant said. And mentorship, yes. Grant's gaze softened just slightly. She would have approved. Ellison hesitated. Will she testify? Grant considered. If necessary. But she prefers outcomes over appearances. Ellison sighed. I wish I'd met her sooner. Grant stood. You did. You just didn't see her. Miles away, Evelyn Carter stood on the edge of a small rental property overlooking a quiet stretch of coastline. The house wasn't impressive, weathered wood salt in the air, but it was hers, at least for now. She set her bag down inside and opened the windows, letting the ocean breeze move through the space. No alarms, no radios, just wind and waves. Evie stood barefoot on the porch, watching gulls circle. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Carter, she said. Ma'am, came a voice she didn't recognize. Younger, formal. This is Lieutenant Harris. I was told I could reach you at this number. Evie closed her eyes briefly. Go ahead, Lieutenant. There's a family asking questions, he said carefully. About a mission years back. They don't know details. They just want to know if someone remembers. Evie leaned against the railing. The memory rose unbidden dust, heat the weight of a decision that had altered more than one life. I remember, she said. The lieutenant hesitated. Would you be willing to speak with them? Off the record. Yes, Evie said. But not yet. Give them my assurance first. I will, he said. Thank you. She ended the call and stared out at the horizon, the line where sky met water blurring in the midday haze. Not today, she thought again. But soon. Back at Street Elara, the day grew busy. An accident on the interstate flooded the ER with injuries. Stretchers lined the hallways. Voices rose. Decisions stacked. And in the middle of it, something remarkable happened. No one shouted. Teams moved fluidly, nurses anticipating needs, residents coordinating instead of competing. Marianne barked orders when needed, but more often she didn't have to. Lucas found himself remembering Evie's words, quiet rooms matter. He slowed his breathing, focused, a patient coded in Bay 2. The room filled instantly. Compressions began. Meds pushed. Time stretched. Lucas caught a hesitation in a junior nurse's eyes. Say it, he said. She's not responding the way she should, the nurse said quickly. I think we're missing something. Lucas trusted her, adjusted course. The rhythm returned. When the patient stabilized, the room exhaled as one. Later, as they cleaned up, the nurse laughed shakily. I almost didn't speak. Lucas met her gaze. I'm glad you did. That evening, Grant stood once more in the corridor where the salute had happened. The space looked ordinary now, scuffed floors, peeling paint near the corner. But she could still see it, still feel the gravity. She turned to leave, then stopped at the lockers. One remained empty. Grant rested her hand briefly against the metal. Fair winds, she murmured. The ocean wind picked up as dusk fell at Evie's rental. She cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and sat with the quiet. No television, no distractions. As darkness settled, she stepped outside again, phone in hand. She scrolled to the contact she hadn't touched yet. If it happens again. She didn't call. She didn't delete it either. Instead, she slid the phone back into her pocket and looked up at the stars, faint but present, fighting through the coastal haze. Some nights demanded action. Others demanded restraint. Tonight she allowed herself to rest. And far away in a hospital that had learned finally that silence could hold strength, people moved with a little more care. Not because they feared being watched, but because they had seen what quiet integrity could do when it was no longer ignored. The first crack in the story came from a place no one expected. Not the hospital, not the Navy, but a veteran support group that met every Thursday night in the basement of a community center, 3 miles from Street Elara Medical Center. A man named Thomas Reed, mid-60s, oxygen tank at his side, had listened quietly, while the facilitator read aloud a brief notice from a legal aid organization, something about reinstated benefits and an anonymous whistleblower. Thomas's hands had started to shake. He didn't interrupt. He waited until the meeting ended, until the chairs were stacked and the room thinned out. Then he asked one question. Did it say when this started? The facilitator checked the email. The complaint traces back years. First filed internally, never processed. Thomas closed his eyes. He remembered a night 12 years ago, burning heat, dust clogging his lungs, a field hospital lit by generators that flickered like dying stars. He remembered the medic who had grabbed his vest when he collapsed, voice calm even as rounds cracked in the distance. "Stay with me. Look at me. Breathe." He remembered the eyes, the same ones he'd seen briefly on a hospital floor 2 nights ago, before the news went quiet. Thomas went home and opened a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folded letter yellowed at the edges. No return address, just a name written in careful block letters. E. Carter. By the next morning, the legal aid office received a call. By noon, Commander Olivia Grant received a message marked priority. She read it twice, then closed her eyes slowly. So it's starting, she thought. At Street, Ilara, Dr. Ellison felt the shift before he saw it. Emails, calls, requests for clarification. Not accusations yet, but curiosity. Veterans asking questions, families seeking records, journalists circling without landing. Ellison convened another meeting, this time smaller. Legal, compliance, communications. "We don't name her," Ellison said firmly. "We don't speculate." "And if they already know," someone asked. Ellison paused. "Then we respond with facts and humility." Meanwhile, Lucas Bennett found himself standing in front of a mirror in the on-call room, adjusting his badge. He didn't recognize the person looking back at him, not because he'd changed overnight, but because he'd finally noticed what had always been there. He thought of Evie's last words to him. "Listen more than you speak." That afternoon, a patient's daughter pulled him aside. "Thank you," she said, "for explaining, for not rushing." Lucas nodded. "Thank the nurses." She smiled. "I did." Miles away, Evelyn Carter sat at a small wooden table in her rental papers spread before her. She hadn't planned on this, not yet. But the call from Lieutenant Harris echoed in her mind. Families asking questions, wanting to know if someone remembered. She reached for the phone. This time she didn't hesitate. The line rang once. Grant came the commander's voice. "It's starting," Evie said. "Yes," Grant replied. "Are you okay with that, Evie?" Considered the ocean visible through the window. The steady rhythm of waves. "I didn't hide to protect myself," she said. "I hid to protect others. If this helps them, then it's time." Grant exhaled softly. "We'll keep your boundaries. Thank you." They hung up. 2 days later, a sealed packet arrived at Street Ilara addressed to Dr. Ellison. Inside were sworn statements, veterans, nurses, administrators from other institutions, all pointing to the same pattern of obstruction tied back to Dylan Hargrove. The evidence was overwhelming. So was the silence from Hargrove himself. Held without bail, pending further charges, he watched the walls close in, not with drama, but inevitability. No speeches, no deals, just paperwork and time. And in that quiet, he realized the thing that terrified him most. No one was coming to save him. The first article appeared online that evening. No photos, no names, just a headline that spread fast. Hospital whistleblower helped uncover years of veteran care obstruction. Comments flooded in. About time, someone finally did the right thing. Respect to the quiet ones. Evie read it once, then closed the browser. That night, she drove 20 miles inland to a small town where the lights were fewer and the stars brighter. She parked near a modest house with a flag folded neatly in a display case by the door. Thomas Reed answered, surprised. "Yes," he asked. Evie removed her jacket, standing in the porch light. "Mr. Reed," she said gently. "I'm Evelyn." He stared at her, breath catching. You were there." She nodded. "I was." His eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He simply stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table for hours. No recordings, no notes. Just memories, some painful, some healing. Evie listened more than she spoke. At the end, Thomas reached into the box on the shelf and handed her the letter. "I never mailed it," he said. "Didn't know where." Evie unfolded it, read it, folded it again. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I know," Thomas replied, "but I needed to say it." When she left, the porch light stayed on long after her car disappeared down the road. Back at Street, Ilara Marianne posted a new schedule. Night shift staffing increased. Mandatory ethics training announced. A mentorship board went up in the break room. Someone taped a handwritten note beneath it. Quiet doesn't mean weak. No one took it down. As the week closed, Commander Grant stood in her office reviewing final approvals. She paused at one file classified, stamped, sealed. She picked up the phone. "It's done," she said when Evie answered. "Protections are in place. The families will be heard." "Good," Evie said. Grant hesitated. "You sure you don't want credit?" Evie smiled faintly. "Justice doesn't need my name." She ended the call and stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The story was no longer hers alone, and that she realized was the most powerful ending of all. The federal investigation didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like winter, slow, thorough, impossible to argue with once the temperature dropped. At Street Alara Medical Center, the first visible sign wasn't uniforms or flashing lights. It was a calendar invite. Mandatory compliance review, all department heads. Time 8:00 a.m. Location executive conference room. By 7:45, the hall outside the room looked like a waiting area before surgery. Tight mouths, restless hands forced small talk that died before it formed. Dr. Howard Ellison stood near the window, watching the parking lot fill with government vehicles, sedans, vans, a single SUV with tinted windows. He felt exposed, like the hospital itself had been pulled into harsh daylight. Commander Olivia Grant entered without ceremony. Two agents followed, one older man with steel-gray hair and a binder that looked heavy enough to break a table, and a younger woman who carried a laptop case and a quiet intensity. "Doctor," Ellison Grant said, "this is Agent Miles Kessler and Agent Nia Bowman. They're leading the operational side." Ellison shook hands, trying to keep his grip steady. "We're cooperating fully." Kessler's smile was polite and empty. "You'll have plenty of chances to prove that." They sat. Doors closed. The room sealed into stillness. Agent Bowman opened her laptop. "We've reviewed the initial documentation," she said. "We're here to confirm scope and prevent interference." Kessler slid the binder onto the table and flipped it open. Tabs, names, dates. A timeline of small decisions that stacked together looked like something far uglier. "We're not here because one man was arrested," Kessler said. "We're here because the system allowed him to operate." Ellison swallowed. "Understood." Kessler tapped a page. Veteran care priority flags were altered repeatedly. Certain patients were routed away from specialist consults. Cases were delayed until transfer windows closed, and billing codes were adjusted in ways that suggest intentional obstruction. The department heads shifted uncomfortably. Bowman spoke next. "We also have evidence of retaliation, schedule manipulation, performance write-ups timed to benefit disputes, HR suppression." A few people stared down at their hands. Grant's gaze swept the room. "This isn't optional," she said quietly. "And this won't be buried." The words landed like a verdict. Across town, Dylan Hargrove sat in a holding facility where time had no personality. The walls were bland, the air stale. He'd spent his entire career controlling environments. Now he couldn't control the light above his head. He had two choices: deny until the end or bargain. He tried bargaining first. His attorney leaned close through the glass. "They have emails, and witness statements, and a sealed packet from the Navy. This is not a hospital HR issue anymore." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I can explain optics. I can explain budget pressure. I can. You can't explain intent," the attorney said. "And intent is what they're building." Hargrove's eyes flickered. "Who did this to me?" The attorney hesitated. "You already know." The name sat in Hargrove's mind like a splinter: Evelyn Carter. The quiet nurse. The invisible one. The one he'd tried to erase because she made him feel watched. He realized then what had always made him angry. She never feared him. Back at Street Alara, the investigation changed daily life in small ways that felt huge. Doors that used to be locked opened. Files that used to be missing suddenly appeared. Staff who had been silenced found a strange, shaky courage. Marissa Klein from HR came forward with a trembling folder and a sentence that started quiet and ended like a confession. "I was told to bury these," she said. "I did. And I'm sorry." Ellison didn't yell. He didn't punish her. He asked one question. Are you ready to unbury them? Marissa nodded, tears spilling. Yes. The next day, 3 former nurses returned to Street, Ilara, for interviews. They sat in a neutral room with government agents and spoke about retaliation so normalized they'd once thought it was their fault. One nurse, Janice Whitmore, described being written up for insubordination after advocating for a veteran patient who needed a consult. They told me I was emotional, she said. They told me I needed to learn my place. Agent Bowman's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened on her pen. Who told you that Janice's voice shook? Dylan Hargrove, and a supervisor who was scared of him. Ellison sat in the back of the room and felt shame bloom in his chest. He'd been the director. He'd been the one who should have seen it. But he hadn't, because he'd been looking at numbers, not people. That night, Lucas Bennett stayed late, reviewing a case that now looked different under the lens of ethics. A veteran patient he'd once seen transferred too quickly came back to mind. Lucas pulled the chart, traced the decision points. A note stood out. Consult deferred per ops guidance. Lucas stared at it. He remembered how certain decisions had always felt inevitable, like the hospital was a machine and he was just one cog. Now he saw the truth: someone had been steering the machine from the shadows. He walked to Marianne's station holding the chart. I think this was wrong, Lucas said quietly. Marianne looked at the paper, then at him. Then write it down, she said. He hesitated. If I do, it could. It should, Marianne cut in. That's the point. Lucas nodded, throat tight, and went to the compliance portal Ellison had implemented. His hands shook as he typed. But he didn't stop. Miles away on the coast, Evelyn Carter lived in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. She woke early, ran along the shoreline, cooked simple meals read in silence. Yet even here the world reached her. A letter arrived. No return address. Only her name, Evelyn Carter, written in clean print. Inside was a single page, an official request. You are asked to provide testimony under protective protocol regarding events related to Street Ilara Medical Center and prior service incidents. Evie read it twice, then set it down. She didn't feel fear. She felt the weight of finishing what she'd started. Her phone buzzed a minute later. Grant. You got it, Grant said. Yes. We can minimize exposure, Grant continued. Closed session. No cameras. No press. But your words will matter. Evie stared out at the ocean. They always do, she said softly. That's why I stayed silent until it was necessary. Grant paused. Are you angry, Evie? Considered the question. Then no. I'm disappointed in how easy it is to ignore suffering when it's inconvenient. And hopeful? Grant asked. Evie's mouth curved faintly. Maybe. Because I saw people change. Grant exhaled. We'll arrange transport. I'll drive, Evie said. Grant didn't argue. 2 days later, Evelyn Carter would walk into a federal building without a uniform, without a badge, and speak the truth in the same calm voice she used in the ER. Not to be celebrated, not to be remembered, but to make sure the next quiet nurse and the next veteran patient would never have to fight alone in the dark. The federal building didn't look intimidating from the outside. Glass, concrete, clean lines. The kind of place designed to feel neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Just official, just inevitable. Evelyn Carter parked 3 levels down in the underground garage and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary. The engine was already off. The silence wasn't heavy, but it was deliberate. This wasn't hesitation, it was calibration. She checked her watch. 8:14 a.m. Right on time. Inside, security was efficient and quiet. No one stared. No one whispered. Her name was checked against a list and a temporary badge slid across the counter without ceremony. E. Carter Visitor. She clipped it to her jacket and followed the hallway signs until a door marked Closed. Session authorized. Personnel only came into view. Commander Olivia Grant waited just outside, posture relaxed but alert. You ready? Grant asked. Evie nodded. I've been ready for years. Grant opened the door. The room inside was smaller than Evie expected. No gallery. No audience. Just a long table, 3 federal officials, 2 agents she recognized from the investigation, and a court reporter setting up quietly in the corner. No cameras. Just truth. Evie took the seat offered to her, folded her hands and waited. Agent Miles Kessler began. For the record, please state your name. Evelyn Carter, profession nurse. Formally. Kessler's eyes flicked up briefly. Formally, yes, Evie said evenly. That chapter has closed. Kessler nodded, then glanced at his notes. Miss Carter, you served in a classified medical capacity attached to special operations units. Is that correct? Yes. And after leaving service, you were employed at Street Alara Medical Center for 8 years, Evie said. Night shift. Bowman leaned forward. During that time, did you observe irregularities related to veteran care? Evie didn't hesitate. Yes. Please describe them. Evie spoke the way she always had. Precise, calm, unembellished. She outlined delayed consults, altered routing, subtle pressures that pushed vulnerable patients to the margins. She named patterns, not people. Then Kessler asked the question everyone else had avoided. Why didn't you report this sooner? Evie met his gaze. I did. He raised an eyebrow. Internally, she continued, multiple times. The reports were buried. When retaliation began, I gathered evidence quietly. Bowman's voice softened. Why quietly? Evie's answer was simple. Because loud accusations get dismissed. Quiet proof gets archived. Kessler scribbled something down. Grant watched from the corner, saying nothing. Did Mr. Hargrove know who you were? Bowman asked. Evie shook her head. Not at first, and when he began targeting you, Evie paused for the first time. When he sensed I wasn't afraid, she said. Power like his depends on fear. I didn't give him any. The room went still. Kessler cleared his throat. Miss Carter, are you aware that your testimony may result in additional charges? Yes. And you're comfortable proceeding? Evie nodded. Comfort isn't relevant. The session lasted nearly 4 hours. By the end, the court reporter's hands ached, and the stack of exhibits had doubled. When Evie finally stood, her body felt tired in the honest way that followed completion, not exhaustion but closure. Kessler rose as well. Miss Carter, he said, extending a hand. On behalf of this office, thank you. Evie shook it once. Firm. Neutral. Grant walked her out. You did exactly what was needed, Grant said quietly in the hallway. Evie exhaled. Then let it end here. Grant stopped near the exit. It won't. Not completely. Evie looked at her. Change rarely ends cleanly. Grant continued. But it starts with moments like this. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, washing the steps in pale gold. Evie stood for a moment, letting the light warm her face. No applause. No salutes. Just daylight. Back at Street Alara, the consequences arrived in waves. 2 supervisors were placed on administrative leave. 1 resigned before noon. Policies were rewritten, real ones, not cosmetic edits. The ethics channel filled with reports that had waited years to be spoken aloud. Ellison read every one. Marianne watched the changes with cautious optimism. She'd seen reform attempts before, but this time the fear was gone. People spoke without checking who might be listening. Lucas Bennett submitted a formal statement that afternoon, his name attached without hesitation. When he hit send, his hands shook, but he didn't regret it. That evening, Ellison called an all-staff message, not a meeting, just a message. We failed because we stopped listening. We will not make that mistake again. In a holding facility miles away, Dylan Hargrove received word that additional charges were being filed. Obstruction, retaliation, federal violations tied to veteran care. He sat on the edge of his bunk, reading the notice twice. No anger this time. Just the hollow realization that the system he'd manipulated had finally turned its full attention on him. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. 2 weeks later, Evelyn Carter returned to Street Alara one last time. Not in scrubs, not on shift. She walked through the lobby in plain clothes, unnoticed at first. Then Marianne spotted her. Evie, she said softly. Others turned. Evie lifted a hand, signaling calm. I'm just passing through. Ellison met her near the elevator. I wanted to thank you, he said, properly. Evie shook her head. Thank the people who stayed. Ellison hesitated. If you ever want, I won't, Evie said gently. But you'll be fine. She glanced around the ER. The noise, the movement, the life. It felt healthier. As she left, a young nurse held the door open for her. "Thank you," the nurse said. "For what?" Evie asked. The nurse smiled, unsure how to explain. "For making it safer to be quiet." Evie stepped outside the door, closing softly behind her. Her phone buzzed once. A single message from Grant, "It's done." Evie typed back 2 words. "Good. Take care." She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward the parking lot, blending into the afternoon traffic without a backward glance. Her final shift had ended quietly, just as it began. But the echo of what she'd done would stay long after the badges were changed, long after the files were closed. Because sometimes the most powerful justice doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with calm certainty. And it stays. The trial never became a spectacle. That more than anything surprised the media. There were no leaked photos of the courtroom, no breathless pundit panels arguing motives. Names appeared in print, then disappeared beneath procedure and law. The work moved forward the way real accountability often did, slow, methodical, resistant to drama. But inside Street, Elara Medical Center, the impact was impossible to miss. 3 months after Evelyn Carter's final shift, the night staff gathered in the same break room where she had once sat in silence, finishing charts while others talked over her. The walls were the same. The coffee was still terrible. But the mood had changed. Marianne stood at the whiteboard, reviewing assignments. "We're running 2 full trauma teams tonight," she said. "Float nurse is covered. Veteran consult line is staffed on call." A ripple of approval moved through the room. Alyssa Park, no longer the trembling new hire, raised her hand. "I flagged a potential medication interaction earlier. Pharmacy confirmed." "We adjusted." Marianne smiled. "Good catch." Across the room, Lucas Bennett leaned against the counter, listening more than speaking. He'd been offered a fast-track promotion, one that would have thrilled him months ago. He'd asked for time instead, not because he didn't want responsibility, because he wanted to earn it right. At 9:42 p.m., a trauma alert came in: multi-vehicle collision on the interstate. Stretchers rolled. Voices rose. The ER snapped into motion, and for a brief moment Lucas found himself looking toward the spot near Bay 4 where Evie had once stood. The reflex surprised him. He shook it off, not because he wanted to forget her, but because she'd taught him not to wait for guidance when action was needed. He took a breath. "Let's move," he said. The team did. 2 states away, Evelyn Carter lived in a rhythm that felt almost foreign. Her mornings began before sunrise, runs along the shoreline measured in miles instead of minutes. She tracked her pace by breath, not time. The old habits remained, but without urgency. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, she sat on the porch of her rented house repairing a loose railing board. The work was simple, tangible. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Carter." "Miss Carter," a woman's voice said. "My name is Janice Whitmore. I worked at Street. Elara. I don't know if you remember me." Evie closed her eyes. "I remember." Janice's breath caught. "I just wanted to say," I testified. "I almost didn't, but I did." "I'm glad," Evie said. "They asked if I was afraid," Janice continued. "I told them no, not anymore." Evie smiled softly. "That's how it starts." After the call ended, Evie sat quietly for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the grass. Fear doesn't disappear, she thought. It just loses its authority. The verdict came on a Tuesday. Guilty, on multiple counts. Sentencing scheduled. No cheers, no celebrations. In the holding area, Dylan Hargrove stared at the table in front of him, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The judge's words echoed in his mind, not loud, not angry, just final. His power had evaporated without drama. No one saluted him on the way out. At Street, Elara Ellison gathered department heads and delivered the news in a single sentence. "It's over." No applause followed. Instead, people returned to work. That evening, a small plaque appeared near the nurse's station, not grand, not shiny, just brushed metal with engraved words. "In honor of those who serve without recognition, and those who choose integrity when no one is watching." No name. Lucas noticed it while grabbing gloves. He paused, touched the edge of the plaque once, and went back to work. Weeks later, a package arrived at Evie's door. No return address. Inside was a folded letter and a simple enamel pin shaped like a caduceus, worn smooth at the edges. The letter read, "You didn't save my life that night. You gave me back my courage. I'm teaching again. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. L. B." Evie held the pin between her fingers, then set it carefully on the shelf beside the folded photo from years ago. She didn't wear it. She didn't need to. That winter a storm rolled in from the coast, heavy rain pounding against the windows. Evie woke before dawn, heart racing, the echo of rotor wash still vivid in her mind. Old reflex. She sat up, breathing through it, letting the present reassert itself. No alarms. No calls. Just rain. Later that morning, she drove into town and stopped at the community center where the veteran support group met. Thomas Reed was there, setting up chairs. "You came," he said, smiling. "I said I would," Evie replied. She stayed for the meeting this time. Not as a listener in the back. Not as a speaker up front. Just as someone present. Stories were shared. Some heavy. Some hopeful. When it ended, a younger veteran approached her hesitantly. "They said you'd understand," he said. Evie nodded. "Let's take a walk." Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist. They walked slowly, conversation unhurried. Back at Street Alara, the night shift rolled on. Alyssa Park corrected a dosage error before it reached a patient. A janitor paused to help a confused elderly man find the restroom. Lucas backed a nurse's judgment in front of a demanding consultant. Small moments. Unseen. Exactly the kind Evie had built her life on. As spring approached, Evie received one final call from Commander Grant. "It's finished," Grant said. "All of it." Evie leaned against the porch railing, watching the horizon lighten. "Good. There's an official commendation," Grant added. "If you want it." Evie smiled, eyes closing briefly. "No." Grant laughed softly. "I thought you'd say that." They said goodbye without ceremony. That night, as Evie prepared dinner, her phone buzzed once more. A message from an unknown number. "First night on my own." I listened. It worked. "Thank you." Evie typed a reply and then erased it. Instead, she placed the phone face down and returned to the stove. Some lessons didn't need answers. They just needed to be carried forward. And in hospitals, in courtrooms, in quiet rooms where hard choices were made, that lesson endured, passed from one steady hand to the next, unseen but unbreakable. Spring arrived quietly, the way real change often did. At Street Alara Medical Center, cherry trees near the parking structure began to bloom soft pink against concrete and steel. Most people passed them without noticing, but some paused now. Some looked twice. The hospital no longer spoke Evelyn Carter's name out loud very often. It didn't need to. Her absence had become a presence. Night shift handovers ran smoother. Nurses spoke with confidence that no longer sounded like defiance. Doctors asked questions instead of issuing assumptions. The system, imperfect and strained as ever, had learned something fundamental: silence did not mean submission. Lucas Bennett stood at the nurses' station at 1:36 p.m., reviewing a trauma case with Alyssa Park. She pointed to a line in the chart. "I think we should escalate this now," she said. "Not wait." Lucas didn't hesitate. "Do it." As Alyssa moved, Lucas caught his reflection in the glass, calmer, steadier than the man he'd been months earlier. He thought briefly of Evie, then corrected himself. No, he thought of the lesson she'd left behind. Across town, Dr. Howard Ellison sat alone in his office long after the day staff had gone home. He reread the latest compliance report, cleaner than any he'd seen in years. Not perfect, honest. He opened a drawer and removed a folded memo he'd kept since that night. The first line was underlined in pen: "Quiet proof outlasts loud excuses." Ellison closed the drawer carefully. Elsewhere, consequences continued their slow work. Dylan Hargrove was transferred to a federal correctional facility far from the city he'd once controlled. His world had shrunk to routines and rules he didn't write. Appeals were denied. Allies were absent. In the end, no dramatic downfall followed him, only obscurity. And that, for a man like him, was the hardest sentence of all. On the coast, Evelyn Carter woke before dawn, as she always did. She brewed coffee and stepped onto the porch, watching the horizon shift from deep blue to pale gold. She no longer ran every morning. Some days she walked instead, letting her body decide the pace. Her phone lay on the small table beside her chair. The contact labeled, "If it happens again," was still there. She hadn't used it. She hoped she never would. After breakfast, she drove inland to the community center. The veteran support group had grown new faces, younger ones. Some carried visible scars. Others hid them well. Evie didn't lead the group. She didn't sit at the front. She listened. A young man spoke about guilt that wouldn't let him sleep. A woman spoke about anger she didn't know how to set down. Evie offered no grand speeches, just questions, grounding reminders, shared silence. Afterward, Thomas Reed walked her to the door. "They trust you," he said. Evie shook her head. "They trust themselves. I just remind them how." As she drove home, the radio crackled with a local news update brief, easily missed. Federal oversight concludes review of regional hospital systems. Officials cite improved compliance and patient advocacy measures. Evie turned the radio off. That evening, she cooked dinner for herself and ate at the small table by the window. The sky darkened. Stars emerged one by one. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lucas Bennett. "We had a case tonight. Veteran. Complex." We listened. He stabilized. "I just wanted you to know your work didn't end when you left." Evie read it once. She typed a reply. "It never does. Keep going." She set the phone down. Later, as night settled fully, Evie opened the small box where she kept the few objects she'd carried across every chapter of her life. The worn dog tag, the folded photo, the enamel pin. She picked up the dog tag, running her thumb over the stamped letters. Then gently, deliberately, she placed it back. Some identities were meant to be honored. Others were meant to be released. Evie stepped outside once more. The ocean was calm, reflecting moonlight in broken silver lines. She breathed in the salt air, feeling the steady certainty of someone who had finished what she'd been called to do and accepted what came next. Miles away in hospitals and quiet rooms, people made better choices because someone once had. Not because she demanded recognition. Not because she raised her voice, but because when it mattered most, she stood firm in silence and refused to look away. And that was how her final shift truly ended, not with salutes or helicopters, but with a legacy woven into countless unseen moments carried forward by people who had learned at last to respect the quiet ones. Some heroes never ask to be seen. They don't chase applause, titles, or validation. They show up when it's inconvenient, stay when it's uncomfortable, and speak only when silence would cause harm. Evelyn Carter was never just a nurse. She was a reminder that integrity doesn't need an audience to matter. The truth is, many of the most important battles aren't loud. They happen in night shifts, in overlooked rooms, in moments where someone must decide whether it's easier to stay quiet or necessary to stand firm. Real courage isn't about power over others. It's about responsibility to those who depend on you, especially when no one is watching. This story isn't about secret identities or dramatic reveals. It's about what happens when quiet competence meets moral clarity. When someone chooses to protect others instead of themselves. When respect is earned not through rank but through consistency and care. So the next time you pass someone who works without recognition, someone who listens more than they speak, remember, this strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently, does the right thing, and trusts that justice will arrive in its own time. If this story moved, you comment where you're watching from and share the moment that stayed with you. And don't forget to subscribe. More powerful stories about hidden courage and real justice are coming.